Okay, it seems that it works now. Hello everyone, welcome to the stream. Third time is a charm, they say. Hopefully internet issues are fixed and hopefully we can have a nice and productive stream. Uh, Again, this stream is one of the many in the series from 0 to 2000 FIDE It is aimed to help novice players improve their strength and reach 2000 FIDE based on the knowledge that I had that helped me reach that FIDE 20 years ago. Uh, the previous broadcasts can be found on my YouTube channel under the playlist with the same name from 0 to 2000 FIDE. So there are plenty of good stuff there. You can check them out. I believe that they will help you improve your game. Today we talk about weak squares. This is very important topic. Sadly, on many chess courses or chess manuals, books, whatever, they skip it and they leave it for later and they just give you this generic definition and couple of famous games, but they never give you a proper definition that I will try to give in this stream. And I really struggle with the title of this stream because weak square and the definition that goes with it, it's not really quite precise. And it won't explain you why one side won the game or lost the game. And that is important for you to know from the get-go. Because I know when I was starting to learn chess, not knowing this concept hindered my game a lot. I would make weaknesses that my opponents would exploit, and I didn't understand why. Once I understood why, my strength skyrocketed. And a couple of weeks ago, I started revising my knowledge about the weak squares, trying to prepare for this uh, stream. And just by going again through all the games, through all the examples, through my losses, uh, it helped me a lot to improve, and I broke from 2000 ELO on chess.com up to 2200 ELO. So that's 200 ELO uh, jump, which is not insignificant. So this topic is really, really important. Therefore, I'll try to cover it as properly as possible. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the chat, and I will reply the best I can. But for now, since there are no questions, let us continue with the stream on this topic, and let's first define what is a weak square. Weak square is a square that is not controlled by your pawn. Those squares tend to become weak. Why? Because your opponent can put a piece there, and that piece can become annoying, can become very effective, maybe in the attack against your king. Maybe it will put pressure on your position, harass your pieces. Maybe it will deny access to certain relevant squares for your pieces. And you cannot drive it away. That's the beauty of the pawn. That's why you want to have option of controlling that square with the pawn. Pawn is the least valuable piece, and pawn does not mind exchanging itself for any piece on the board. It doesn't hold true for the pieces. Pieces do not want to be exchanged for the pawn. So when a pawn attacks a piece, that piece usually needs to retreat. If we don't have a pawn controlling a square, an opponent puts a piece on that square that is annoying for us, we have only two options. We can exchange it or attack it with a less valuable piece of our own, hoping to drive it away. And that sometimes is not a possibility, as we shall see in some examples. So when we play pawn moves, we need to be very careful. We need to first assess which squares will be weakened, and can we cover them? Will those squares become important later in the game for the opponent or for us? So let me show you a simple example, and you will notice that I'm using ChessBase Lite instead of a browser, because this is a third time that I have launched a stream, and previous two collapsed because my internet provider sucks. So instead of using a Chrome browser that eats a lot of computer resources, I'm using ChessBase Lite, a desktop app that in order to save some bandwidth. Okay, so this is an example position. Practically a starting position, but with some of the pieces left out to keep it more simple. So every time you make a pawn move, you weaken a square. That is something that nobody told me when I was starting out. And only recently I figured that one out when I analyzed my games uh, in the Indian openings as white. Because I lost so many games on tactics, on some maneuvers, tricky tactical shots, and I couldn't understand why was I losing. I mean, why I had space advantage, I cramped the guy, I pushed him against the wall, and somehow he, like a soap, became slippery and just got out of the cage, and all of a sudden the counterattack was devastating and I would lose. And the problem was that I played too aggressively, giving him squares that were weak, but I never considered that. But he had tactical shots, his pieces would reposition on those squares, and all of a sudden uh, he would gain chances to enter into my camp from the side. And it didn't end gloriously for me. So, what am I talking about? Well, let's take this e pawn, for example, highlighted with green color on the diagram. He does control d3 square and f3 square. Now imagine if I move this pawn for one square ahead, e3. You see that this square d3 and this square f3 is no longer controlled by this e pawn, by the e pawn. He may no longer control these squares. He did control them when he was on e2, but no longer when he's on e3. That's the catch. Every time you make a pawn move, let's make some random, okay, let's play e5. You see that when the pawn is on e5, he is no longer on e7. On e7, he did control uh, d6 and f6. Now on e2, on e5, pardon, on e5, pawn gained control over new squares, d4 and f4, but notice that these squares are now weakened. We cannot control these squares with our pawn. With the pawn on e7, if our d5 square was a problem, maybe there was a piece, we could play e6 and control that square, drive away the piece from d5. Same goes for the f5 square, because we could play e6 again and drive away the piece from f5. But with the e5 move, we no longer have control over d5 and f5 square. We cannot do the same with the d6 and f6 squares. So the only way we can control these pieces, these squares, pardon, these squares with our pawns is to use c-pawn to control the 6 and d5, and g pawn to control f6 and f5. So if we want to drive away a piece from d5, we would play c6. Let's play some random move. We would play c6 to gain control over the d5 square, or maybe g6 if f5 square was a problem. Now notice what happens if we play c5 for some reason in the game. Notice that d5 square is permanently weak now. Notice that there is no more a pawn move that can control these two squares. We do not have control over these squares. So if we put a piece on d5, we no longer can chase it away with the pawn. And now the question arises, can you exchange that piece for your own? For example, let's give a concrete example. Let's say that we played d4 first, d5, knight f3, f5. Let's say our opponent played these moves. Now watch this. Knight can stay on, go to e5, and now this knight takes away these squares for the king. And let's play just one more move. Just stay with me. And you see now that a queen can come here, and then on f7, actually she will be supported by the knight, and white would have an attack against the king. Let's say that black plays something like this, and I don't know, there is an attack against the king, and let's say he played some stupid move, we have checkmate. In this short, let's say, game, in this short maneuver, we see that the weaknesses, for example, you see again with h6, we no longer control this square because we played h6. There is no pawn on h7 anymore to support the g pawn, so this won't help. Again with h6 we would weaken the g6 square. We see that this knight, let's say king f8 is even better example, queen f7, this knight supported the queen. If this knight wasn't on e5, we wouldn't be able to play queen f7 because king would simply retake on f7 and we would lose a queen as white. This is the problem with the weak squares. Opponent can put a piece that is well positioned there, supports opponent's piece as well for attack, and we cannot drive it away. And again, we can either offer an exchange of that piece. Maybe let's say that we have a knight and we can play knight from b8 to d7, offering an exchange of the knight, or maybe, well, there is no piece that is less valuable than a knight. It's either a knight or a bishop. So sometimes you might not have a knight or a bishop to offer for an exchange. And we'll see that in some examples that follow. And then this knight will dominate. Your position will be very annoying, very unpleasant. Will support his army. In this concrete example, his queen. Will enable her to attack, and then we lose the game. So making a pawn move is very delicate task. So we always need to ask ourselves, what squares will we weaken, and can we cover them in the long run? If not, can the opponent exploit them? Can the opponent install a piece there? And if they can, will that piece actually be annoying for us? Because not every square I mean, is good for every piece, and not every piece stands well on every square. So, for example, No, I'll actually show you another example that illustrates this well. But remember, when you move a pawn, let me remove the color commentary, please, and this too. When you, pardon, when you move a pawn, let's say this pawn forward, remember that squares on the adjacent files get weakened. So this is a short tip that you can remember. Every time you move pawn, squares on the files next to that pawn are weakened. So in this case, if we play e4, these squares are weakened because we no longer have e3 to contest the d4 and f4 square, nor does our e-pawn stand on e2 controlling these important squares. But when you make a pawn move, you do get control over new squares. So our e-pawn does control d5 and f5, and those squares might become useful outposts for our pieces, especially knights. So these are the advantages and disadvantages that you need to take into account when you make a pawn move. Now, let me show you some examples. And I think that is great, this works. In this position, give me a second, please. Okay, we deleted everything. In this position, we see that this knight attacks a weak pawn on a6. Why is this pawn on a6 weak? Because he doesn't have a pawn protection. And this pawn is protected by the bishop. But now this bishop is tied to a defense of the weak pawn. And that is why c5 square, highlighted with green square on this diagram, is a strong square for white and a weak square for black, because knight on c5 creates a strong threat of capturing the a6 pawn and paralyzes the bishop, because bishop will forever have to protect that pawn. He cannot move, because after this, I mean, okay, not like that. I mean, just for example, this pawn will fall, and then we just queen, because this is impossible. We take with the check and simply queen and win the game. So with this bishop being so passive, technically, no matter what you play, this is the best. Putting the pawns on the opposite color of the bishop. Again, king e4. You lose the game because knight controls e6. This f pawn controls f5, and our king controls e5. Therefore, king is effectively pushed back. He needs to move because bishop may not move. The a6 pawn would drop, as we mentioned earlier. And after this move, again, knight controls d7, king controls d6. Black needs to let the king in and cannot defend the a6 pawn, and once the a6 pawn falls, the whole game collapses for black. So c5 square was a strong square for white because knight could have been installed there, and that knight made some did some useful job, very useful job. Now let's take a look at this. One more thing, we didn't have a pawn on d6 nor on d7 nor on b7, so we couldn't have played b6 chasing away the knight, or d6 again chasing away the knight. These pawns are non-existent on the board. So when you make pawn exchanges, you need to take that into an account as well. Which squares will you not control anymore? Are they important for your opponent? Are they important for you? For example, you don't have to be at a disadvantage. Sometimes your opponent may offer an exchange of pawns just to take away strong squares from your pieces. This knight is in this diagram supported by the b4 pawn. So maybe your opponent can offer an exchange of pawns to exchange the b4 pawn, so your knight cannot land on c5. Maybe there will be a black bishop on f8 controlling c5 square. Take that into account as well. But now I would like to show you this same example, but slightly modified. Again, the same pawn structure, but instead of the knight on c5, we have a white bishop. c5 square is still a weak square for black. It is not covered by the pawn on b6. That pawn is missing. There is no pawn on d6 covering that square. It is still a weak square by definition. There is no pawn controlling it, but it is not important square because white cannot use that square to his advantage. He cannot make progress. That is why I disliked the generally accepted definition that a square that is not controlled by a pawn is a weak square. No, a square that is not controlled by a pawn may become weak square. It really depends whether your opponent can use it or not. Because as I have demonstrated in the earlier diagram, with every pawn move, you weaken the squares on the adjacent files. So just by opening the game, by playing the first move with the pawn, you weaken your squares. And those weak squares exist from move 1. Weak squares are those squares that your opponent can exploit by putting a piece there that does a good job at making problems for you. That's a weak square. So c5 square, b6 squares. These are all weak, pardon, mouse slip. These are all weak squares, yes. They are weak squares because they are not controlled by a pawn. All these squares are weak, but actually these are not weak, pardon, because we do have an f pawn controlling e6 and f pawn can go to f6 controlling e5 square. But those highlighted with red are indeed weak squares in black camp. But if white cannot penetrate them, if he cannot put a piece there, for example his king, it's irrelevant. And if you turn on the engine to analyze this position, you'll see that after g5, actually black is, well, give me a second, no, I can just play something like this. Yeah, this is good enough. King e6, and after king d4, king d6, you'll see that black is equal. I don't think, did I, give me a second, did I misplay this? No. Bishop f e4, okay, and on bishop d5, king c7, yeah, king c5. I think the simple bishop d7 holds. All the weak squares, yes. All the weak squares in the position are covered by our king. Therefore, black cannot install any piece. He cannot make progress. Even on bishop a8, does this, give me a second please. I think that this works. Because after this move, we still have bishop d7, and on king d5 we still have bishop d7, and again white king cannot penetrate via weak squares in our camp. He just cannot, because everything is taken care of by our pieces. And since white is to move, well, this bishop has no moves. He cannot go to b7, he cannot go to c6. Therefore, white will have to get out by playing maybe king c5, but then simply returning to c8 gives black enough room to hold defense. And again, these squares are not controlled by the pawns, neither can this square be controlled by a pawn anymore in black position, neither this one. Again, all these squares cannot be controlled by black with pawns. And by definition, these are all weak squares. All these squares are weak. But it doesn't matter because we cannot exploit them as white. So I wouldn't call these squares weak squares. I would introduce a new term called uncontrolled square. And you already see why. Because those squares are not controlled with the pawn, and I will state that those squares tend to become weak squares if the opponent can install a piece there that does something useful. Maybe attacks the king, maybe deprives your pieces of good squares, maybe supports some other square pieces to join the attack, maybe whatever, depends of the position. But again, give me a second. We have this starting position. Again, look at this position. I'll just paste the previous one. Just one simple, again, one simple difference. Knight on c5, bishop on d3. Everything else the same. Everything is the same pawn structure, the same weaknesses, the same squares that are not controlled by the pawns. Everything is the same. Neither of these squares that I have highlighted with red can be controlled by a pawn anymore. All the uncontrolled squares, but they are not weak because opponent cannot install a piece on those squares that does something useful. Now if I again go back to the starting diagram, well, this is a weak square for black because this knight is a monster. He attacks a weak pawn, paralyzing the bishop. He controls the e6 square, so king may not go to e6, maintaining the opposition. And bishop may not go to d7 because knight controls the square. This knight is annoying. And even though we chase away the king, now, our bishop may not go to b7, and he would love to go there. He cannot go to d7, and if he goes to e6, then knight will take a weak pawn on a6 and win the game. And knight does control e6, so king may not go to e6, and it's black's move. So if the bishop may not move, then king must move because it is the only piece that can legally move. And if black cannot go to e6 and cannot go to e5 because our king controls e5, then he needs to let the white king enter the position. After king e5, again it's Zugzwang. Again, the only piece that, f6 is one of the moves that can be played. And after this move, I think this is a winning position for white. Yes, it is, because now black cannot step on his own pawn. He cannot penetrate into white's camp, and white can use this weak square on c6 that is not controlled by a pawn to enter, and then can use the b6 square for himself to attack the a6 pawn, and with two attackers, knight and king, and one defender of the a6 pawn, and that is the black bishop, a6 pawn will drop, and with it the game as well. The only difference in these starting diagrams, the position of the pieces. The position of the pieces. Same pawn structure, kings, everything is the same, but just a different piece for white. White in this diagram can make use of the weak c5 square. In the previous diagram, white cannot make use of the weak c5 square. He cannot make use of it because there is no piece that can successfully be installed there. So remember, every time you make a pawn move, you weaken squares on the adjacent file, on the files next to that pawn. They will become weak. You might not be able to control them with the pawn anymore, but you also gain new squares under your control. And these squares may be uh, available for your pieces uh, to to use. Another important thing that you need to remember, let me show you, is, pardon, just stay with me until I set up the position. Let's do it like this. Is that when you move a pawn forward, uh, you do physically occupy this square. So yes, your opponent may attack the pawn, but you may defend the pawn somehow, maybe with the piece, maybe with the pawn. So even putting a pawn physically on a square helps you control it if you uh, are able to protect it with a piece or a pawn. And another important feature of the pawn play. Let's try to play something like this. And black will be the side that is reckless. And I'll show you why. Okay, before takes, just stay with me. I want to show you a couple of ideas. That are used a lot by the lesser rated players, and then they cry how they had a winning position, but they lost. Okay. Now black played his pawns as long as he could, and now it's white's turn to play. Maybe we could have slightly altered this. Give me a second. E4, pardon. This is much more instructive than the previous example. This is way better. Okay, now look. Black can say, look at my space advantage. Look how many pawns restrict white's pieces, and he is right. But these pawns leave tremendous physical space that is cleared. Look how many these squares are uncontrolled in black's camp. These are all the squares that cannot be controlled by the pawns anymore. These are all the squares that black cannot, pardon, black does not control these squares marked with red on the board. He does not control them with the pawn anymore, and what happens in these positions, and this is my problem that I'm trying to fix in my game, that cost me a lot of points in the internet games because of COVID. I cannot play over the board tournaments. Is that white can sometimes sacrifice a piece, and when he does so, white opens up a file, and in this diagram, this rook just runs rampant. He can go here, for example, and simply snatch this d5 pawn. Maybe he can go to a7, uh, cutting off the black king, and let's say some other piece. Maybe there is another sacrifice that can help white introduce yet another piece into attack. Maybe he can simply go to g7, taking this pawn on g4. A lot of pawn weaknesses now that can be exploited from behind. This is what I'm trying to say, from behind, from the side, sideways. It's very hard for beginners to grasp this. And you shouldn't worry about it because it was very hard for me to grasp this as well until recently, sort of speaking. And in higher level plays, don't be surprised when you see a sacrifice of some sort just to allow your pieces to enter the opponent's position from the side, like this rook did, because there is a lot of empty space. And black king is usually on this first rank, or maybe second rank. Uh, so black king is usually weak on these two ranks. He castled somewhere and he's usually on these two ranks. So you will have ample of space to position your pieces for the attack. Just look how many uh, squares are not controlled by the pawns. And they all tend to become weak should your pieces land on them. And again, I lost so many games where I thought I had a strong space advantage like black in this diagram, only for my opponent to sacrifice a pawn or two, exchange couple of pieces, and all of a sudden, all this free space in my position is available to his pieces, and my king is naked. My king is naked, and I couldn't defend. Or I could defend, but then I would enter the endgame, and then these pawns that are undefended by any other pawn are just would just fall, and of course with a couple of extra pawns my opponents would win. So remember, uh, every time you move a pawn, squares adjacent to that pawn become weak, become uncontrolled. Actually, this is the precise term, are not controlled anymore. So you need to weigh in if this is uh, going to be dangerous for you or not. Look at the opponent's pieces. Look which pieces he can install on those squares and whether those pieces do something useful for him. Not every piece placed, for example, on d4 will be dangerous for white. And pay attention to the space that you leave available at the board. Just because squares highlighted with green are in white's camp and are controlled by white's pieces now does not mean that a couple of moves later black pieces cannot land there and create trouble for white. So pay attention to these two things. Space that your pawn leaves behind him uh, available to opponent's pieces, and the squares next to him that are weakened. Again, another example that illustrates what I was talking about. All these squares in black camp, pardon, this one is, are uncontrolled. Give me a second. Yep, they are uncontrolled squares. They are not controlled by a pawn. But we cannot claim about c6 square that it is weak, nor about b7, nor about c7, nor about any of these squares, actually, because white cannot put a piece there, not even b8, not even a8, because it is controlled by our rook, and white rook cannot claim the a8 square because it can only exchange itself for the rook, and then our rook on b8 will come to the a8, and again we control the a8 square. Same goes for for a7. It is not a weak square. But as I have said so earlier, This pawn move on b5 did weaken these squares because they are physically not covered anymore by the pawn, and we indeed no longer have control on adjacent squares. Let me clear up this a little. By having pawn on b5, we no longer have control over, over these squares anymore. We don't control these squares anymore with the b pawn. However, uh, squares on the c file cannot be taken by the opponent's pieces. So we don't care about b pawn not controlling the squares on the c file. However, the a file in this example is important. And again, a4 and a3 squares are under control by our rook. So rook cannot, rook on a8 cannot go to a4, a3, or a2. But we do not control a5 square with our b pawn. So if we had b pawn on b2, for example, we could play b4, and from b4 we would control a5. So if black is to move, he would love to play rook to a5. It's white's turn in this position, but black would love to play rook a5 because this is an outpost, because it is this square a5 is protected by the pawn. Squares that are protected by the pawn are called outposts, potential outposts. So all these squares are potential outposts because they are controlled by the pawn, and rook would be powerful on any of these squares. So this is what black would love to play, and then double the rooks and he would stand well. But it is white's turn to move, and white has an outpost on a6 thanks to this b pawn. And actually, because black doesn't have this b pawn on b7, he no longer controls a6. And this is a weak square for black, because white can put a piece there that does something useful for him and pressurizes us. This rook puts pressure on the unprotected b pawn, tying b8 rook to its defense. This rook may not be taken by the a8 rook, because now a strong passed pawn will come to its place after the recapture. Therefore, if we take, we'll need to play something like this, and the b6 pawn would drop, and then the d6 pawn would be vulnerable. Again, it's about pawn play. This e pawn, yes, gained a lot of good squares for black, but he no longer is on e7, therefore he no longer controls d6. And in this position, again, couple of moves ago, for example, white this d6 pawn was not weak, and e5 move was very useful for black. But again, you need to take care about the position, about the moves that you choose, and about the moves that are available to your opponent, because now, for example, in this sequence of moves, now all of a sudden the position changed, and now with the sixth rank available to white, d6 pawn is a weakness. And after a7, I threaten rook b8, and then to queen. I can still double attack the king and the rook, and look, I have a winning endgame, because my rook on a6 is very strong. And if black simply ignores and, let's say, tries to come with a king, we just double, and now we attack twice the rook, on a8, and he needs to exchange itself. And after rook a6, again, we have pressure on the weak b6 pawn, and our rook is more active. We do have 7th rank at our disposal. Maybe we'll go rook a7 and then rook d7, attacking the d6 pawn. Again, what happened in the early game, in the opening, maybe e5 was played as a first move by black, seemed fine. Now the game changed, and d6 now is a weakness. Before that, it was not a weakness, it was a useful uh, pawn, strong pawn that supported c and d pawns. But let's change the position just a little. Again, this was the starting position, and I will erase the color commentary as well. This is the starting position. Now let's make another position with the same pawn structure, but different pieces. Again, practically the same pawn structure. And okay, I placed the king on e7 here for black, but it really doesn't matter. Look, this square is still weak for black, and it is strategically important because if, for example, white king could get there, he would attack the b6 weakness. Maybe he could go to a7 and then to c7, attacking both weak pawns. But look, white cannot get there, nor can the bishop. Bishop cannot go here. And even if he could, what would he do on a6? I would just move my bishop to d7 and laugh at the white bishop. White bishop would do nothing on a6. And modern chess literature, modern chess courses give you the definition that a square that is not controlled by the pawn is a weak square and you're in trouble. Well, again, let's take a look. Look, a6 is not controlled by the pawn. I don't. My b pawn is on b6. He should be here, pardon, on b7, so I can control the a6. Am I in trouble as black? Of course not. Of course not. I'm not in trouble. I have no problems. There is no problem for black here because white cannot install a piece on a6 that does anything useful. Again, let's go back to this position from the previous diagram. Let's say that white played somehow passively. Just stay with me. Now look at this. These pawns did a great job previously hindering the black pieces. Let's go for the starting square. You see how black pieces are cramped on the first rank. Pardon? They just, Jesus Christ. Sorry, it's the mouse slip. They're cramped on the first rank, actually 8th if you look at the diagram. Yes, and the white had more space, so he wanted to play rook a6, which was great for him. He used his greater space to gain advantage, but look, that's the beauty of the space advantage. You have more space, you can play more actively, you can put pressure on the opponent. But if you misplay it, like in this just stupid example, white played king g1 slightly passively, then your space advantage turns into a problem. The more pieces come off the board, the bigger the problem for you it becomes, because your pieces are, your pawns are far forward, and the fewer pieces you have, the harder it is for you to protect all the weaknesses in your position. So, because your pieces are not Superman, they cannot exist on both sides of the board. So, this is another problem with pawn play that I indicated earlier. If you do not take care and you exchange too many pieces, then all the space behind these pawns becomes available to your opponent, and you're actually in trouble. You need to cover all these squares, and the pawns that are not protected by pawns, like the ones highlighted with red color on this diagram, become weak. They require piece protection. And if you need to protect them with pieces, your pieces become passive. And when you're passive, you risk getting into Zugzwang. When you get into Zugzwang, you are in such state where every move you make loses. That's why we want to avoid passivity in chess. That's why we want to have active pieces. So take this into consideration when you make the pawn moves. Again, let us recap. When you make pawn moves, for example, you clear space on the board. You clear space on the board, highlighted with yellow color on the, let's do it like this to make it more clear. You clear space on the board so your pieces can move. Your pieces can step on those squares. But if you go too far, I don't know, let's say, if you go too far, those pawns may become overextended. I'll use yellow color. They can become targets, namely the ones highlighted with yellow color in this diagram. And the more pieces get exchanged, and the further the pawns are, for example, let's do it something like, actually not like this. Yeah, okay, let's do it like this. Then a lot of space becomes available to your opponent to put his pieces on. Well, this one is controlled by the pawn, and this one is controlled by the pawn. Okay, but there are a lot of pieces. Actually, c5 cannot be controlled by white pawn anymore, so it is a strong square for the black pieces. So a lot of squares become available to the opponent's pieces, and you really need to take care of those squares. You need to weigh in whether your opponent can use them or not. And if he can, what pieces will come there, because not every piece posted on the square is a strong piece. You need to see what kind of targets that piece will have, what will it attack, what other pieces can support, how does it fit in the opponent's overall plan. And that's something that, again, people don't mention when they talk about weak squares. They just say, hey, you don't control a square with a pawn, it's weak square. No, it isn't. And I showed this in two simple examples, how it is important to see which pieces can occupy that square. So remember, again, when you make the pawn moves, you will get some squares when you make a pawn move. Yes, white played e4, he got e4, if f5 and d5 under his control. Yes, white made d5 move, he's fighting for e6 and c6 control of those squares. But the white also lost control over the adjacent squares, pardon, of that pawn. So d pawn no longer controls c5, d5 no longer, pawn no longer controls e5, and these are all the squares that the d5 pawn no longer controls. And again, it's up to you to weigh in if this is useful for you or not. It depends on the pieces that remain on the board. And I will bother you no longer with the weak squares. Actually, there are a couple of illustrative games that are worth going through. And let me try to see if I can open it here. Why can? No, I cannot, not like this. Let me do it like this then, and change the window. Just give me a second, please, to switch windows. This should work. Let me adjust the size of the window as well. Okay, and this, give me a second. Board. Okay, let's take a look on the illustrative game, and let me just change the window. Edit, change. What the hell? What is this? Board. Something is wrong. Why isn't this working? Here it is. Okay, okay. This is a game played between Yannick Gozzoli and Romain Edward. Give me a second. And we'll go move by move, looking through every move with our newly acquired knowledge. D4. So now white has control over the E5 and C5 squares. So these squares can become outposts because they're protected by the pawn, and a piece that gets lodged there can exert pressure on white position, can become annoying. However, by playing d4, notice that no longer does d pawn control these squares. When he was on d2, he directly controlled these two squares, c3 and d3, and should the need arise, he could go to d3 controlling c4 and d4. These squares currently cannot be exploited by black, so these weaknesses are not a problem for us. Furthermore, both of these squares can be controlled by the pawns in white position, namely b2 pawn can go to b3 controlling c4, and f3 pawn can go to f2 pawn can go to f3 controlling e4 square. So we can deal with this weakness quite easily should the need arise. At the moment, so the disadvantages of the d4 move are negligible, but advantages are huge. Knight f6. Black doesn't want to introduce pawn moves. He wants to keep his pawn structure flexible to attack the white center when he decides it is suitable for him. So he controls the e4 square with the knight. Okay, this is a hyper-modern approach. We'll not deal with the openings in this stream. It's a topic for some other stream that we'll make. It's an introduction to Nimzo-Indian defense. Knight f3. Again, white would love to hop with the knight on e5 since the d4 pawn provides such a nice outpost on e5. d6. White prevents that. White prevents the knight e5 hop with the d pawn. But now c6 squares and e6 are slightly weakened. Still not a problem because our f7 pawn controls the e6, our b pawn controls c6. We have no reason to worry. So the disadvantages of the d6 move are negligible, but advantages are staying at the board. So we have all the benefits of the d6 move at the moment. c4. Now white claims control over d5 square, but now the c4 pawn moved and he covered b3, d3 natively. Again, black cannot exploit this, so we are not worried, but this pawn cannot go to c3 anymore. Therefore, b4 and d4 pawn are slightly weakened, and not being able to support the d4 pawn in the long run is the counterplay that black is actually aiming for. Black will play e5 at some point, maybe threaten to exchange the pawn, and he will claim, all right, this c3 square is slightly loose, d4 square is slightly loose. Yes, you can control it with e3, but in order to control c3 square, this b pawn needs to stay put. And maybe if I can induce b3 move, I will have b2 pawn weak, b2 square weak, because there are no pawns controlling that square, c3 and d4, and that's and already a lot of dark squares that are potentially weak. So I will have something that I can base my counterplay on. And since b4 square will not be protected at the moment, maybe I'll force even a3 move next, and then your b pawn would become weak on b3. So I might start to have an initiative if I get a grip on the dark squares. And it's not going to be pleasant for you, my friend. That's what black is saying. That's what black would like to do, and that's why white needs to play carefully with the pawns on the queen side, because he took so much space, he weakened so many dark squares, as we pointed out in this diagram. He needs to be very careful to maintain their control. Knight bd7, black prepares e5 move, knight c3, e5, nothing special, bishop g5, h6, takes with the queen. Okay, so he didn't want to allow the exchange and the loss of castling rights. Fair enough. Queen f6, e3, queen d8. Okay, queen was not well placed on f6, so black wants to expand the tempo to get it back. Queen c2, and now with e3 move, we no longer have control over the d3 square. And d3 square is uncontrolled square. We'll call it uncontrolled, not a weak square, because opponent cannot exploit it. But you must understand that d3 is a weak uncontrolled square, and c2 is also uncontrolled square. So God forbid, if we move this f pawn 2 squares forward, we will even have e4 square, and actually e2, pardon, square is also uncontrolled square as well. So you see already that there are a lot of squares. d2 is also uncontrolled square. You see how many squares white does not control. And of course, if black can post a piece there, it will be a big trouble for white. At the moment, black cannot do that. So we never pay attention to these facts. That's what hinders the progress of the new players. And what hindered my progress. Only up until recently, I managed to fix this issue and experience a rise in ELO rating. So white is not in trouble, but he needs to pay attention on the squares highlighted with the red color. He needs to weigh in each move he plays, because if he is reckless, opponent might post a piece somewhere there and cause a problem for white. G6. Now f6 square is uncontrolled, and it might become a weakness should an opponent post a piece there. Right now there are plenty of pieces that control the f6 square. Even the bishop can come to g7, and white's pieces are not placed good enough to make use of that. G7 is also a weak square because it is not controlled by the pawn anymore. But all this is not a problem because, again, white cannot bank in on that. But that doesn't mean that these weaknesses do not exist, that they are not uh, present in the position. DE5, 95, 95, DE5. Okay, now with the D pawn gone, the control over C5 square is loosened. There is only B6 move that can take control over B6 over C5 square, and by exchanging the pawns the d pawns, white no longer has control over c5. So black gained more with this exchange, because now he can post a bishop on a good square. His pawn on e5 has maintained his position by d pawn coming to its place. So black does fight for the control over d4 square still. However, d5 square is slightly is soft in black's position and might become a problem, because if you are forced to play c6 to cover that square, your d6 square will become a weakness. And okay, white cannot use it yet, but it might become a problem in the long run. Again, black needs to take care of his dark squares, because these squares are no longer controlled by the pawns. And if he plays c6, then all the squares highlighted with red will become weak, and it might give white prospects to put a knight there maybe, or double the rooks and put one of them to d6. White, on the other hand, with this exchange, no longer has control over. Let's make a fresh drawing. White no longer has control over these squares. So these squares are actually weak in white camp. And again, a d3 square is a square that black might try to exploit by exchanging the bishops and then seeking to put one of the, and then exploit one of the bishops, pardon, and then put one of the heavy pieces on d3. Sorry, it's hot in here and I'm starting to lose my focus a little. Therefore, white needs to take care. He needs to keep the pieces on the board that can control d3, and that's the white bishop. Same goes for black. I would keep the black bishop to keep control over the weak squares, weak dark squares in black camp. Bishop d3, bishop g7, castles long. White doesn't waste time. His king is safe, and he wants to take control over the d file, because this square is very important to him, and he claims that if you ever play c6, d6 square will be also strong for him. Furthermore, white will play, h4, h5, starting the attack on the king. Bishop d7, h4. Black doesn't have much choice. He needs to castle, and now comes a nice move that is the reason that I chose this illustrative game, h5. And because so many pieces are ganged up against the g6 square, this h6 pawn is really, you really don't want to have the pawn on h6. It does nothing, but it has weakened the g6 square. Now white forces black to weaken his light squares. Had the pawn been on h7, black could ignore the white's threat and play some other useful move, but he played h6 in the opening. Let's go back in response to this bishop move. That's why I don't like this h6 move. It never turns out to be good. And now, a couple of moves later, after h5, it comes to bite him in the ass. Now black needs to play g5, and now notice how f5 square is not under control anymore, because e pawn and g pawn had moved, and f6 is also weak because again g pawn and d pawn had moved, and we said so the squares adjacent to the pawns next to the pawns tend to become weak. They're not weak yet. They weren't actually weak yet before the g5, but now f5 is weak, h7 is also weak, and white immediately posts a piece on f5, making a double attack on the bishop. Thankfully, black has tactical salvation because bishop hits the queen, but of course white would not exchange queens. He takes with the queen, and now his queen is posted on a weak square for black, which is a strong square for white. And now the queen is actually very dangerous on this square, and notice that e4 square is no longer controlled by black. He no longer has a d pawn that can be placed on d5 to control e4. f5 pawn is blocked, so he cannot play f5 anymore to take control at e4. So e4 is a strong square for white, and black cannot do anything to take that square away from white. And when knight lands on e4, he will go to f6 at some point, threatening mating attack. Queen e7, knight e4, rook d8, a3, preventing queen b4, king f8. Black started to panic and tries to evacuate the king, but there is no salvation because rook cuts off, the d file. g4, fixing the weaknesses. Now he plays against this bishop because this bishop hits the wall of his pawns, and black has no counterplay. White pieces, stand menacingly strong on the squares that are strong for him, on the account that black cannot chase them away with a pawn. And sadly, black cannot exchange the pieces either. Yes, he might play queen e6, but white will simply ignore it. He can actually take. No, he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to. He can simply shut up and play the game. Maybe he can exchange a pair of rooks and maybe even enter the endgame. Why not? Queen cannot be exchanged successfully, and even if he does, the knight on e4 is a monster, and we talked about it earlier. White knight cannot be exchanged because black bishop attacks only black squares, and knight is on the white square. And from there, knight performs a useful role. Therefore, he is annoying for black, and therefore e4 square is a strong square for white. Yes, white does have an outpost on b4, theoretically speaking. He controls it with the a3 pawn, but that square is not strong square for white because it cannot be used by white pieces. And yes, black does have h4 square that is strong for him because white cannot chase away the piece on h4, but he cannot make use of it. That's why the current definition of the weak square is not precise enough. b6 doesn't do much. And now, of course, white wants to enter the endgame. And now knight goes to f5. c6. There was no reason for that move. He should have played maybe queen d7. Queen h7. Again, weak square that is not covered by the pawn. Bishop f8. Of course not queen h8 because white would love to exchange queens. Bishop f8. Knight f5. And now again, knight supports the attack. He harasses the king. He also attacks the weakness on h6. And the queen also has, you see how many weak squares are at her disposal. And this pawn is actually weak now. It's under attack. f6. And again, this pawn move, f6, does protect the pawn, but no longer protects e6, no longer protects g6, and physically clears the g7, the f7 square. So look how many light squares are not under control in black camp. Pawn play, and of course white capitalizes on that. Queen d7. Now queen tries to cover the light squares, but she cannot cover everything. B5, and of course queen g6, queen f7. Of course she attacks the, pardon. She attacks the king and the pawn, so you cannot really allow the f6 pawn to fall. This is a linchpin of your entire position. And here, yeah, there is a pin. So, the queen, the black queen cannot move, nor the king. So white plays king c3, nice grandmaster move. I would simply take on f7, but it's okay, it doesn't matter. He simply penetrates the position because now, yeah, and he won a pawn, and white can open up the position. Simply, yeah, he'll play knight a5, even stronger than what I wanted to play. I wanted to play b5. After knight a5, a5 is a strong square, strong outpost, because knight would attack the weakness on c6. Yeah, and the black bishop has nothing to attack. Again, it's about the moves that these pawns made and the weaknesses that they created. They no longer controlled the squares highlighted with red, and that enabled white to position his pieces on those squares. And those pieces incidentally did do something useful for white, which in the end led to a crash of the black position. Black had no counterplay because white controlled every weak square in his position in some way, either by a piece or by a pawn. And the endgame again was good for white because black bishop cannot exchange itself for the knight. And that's what I was talking about. Sometimes you won't be able to exchange a piece and it will sit on a strong square like this knight and be menacingly strong. So there is not much that you can pick up from this game. Forcing f6 and weakening the light squares, and then it's just a matter of technique how to win. So before we continue to the last game, we'll make a short break. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you for your patience. I'm back. Uh, okay, let's take a look at the final illustrative game. Just give me a second, please. And what about this one? Yannick will turn that off. And again, we'll edit the scene, change to, okay. Uh, to this window. This game was played between Pilnik and Geller in Gothenburg Interzonal Qualification Tournament in 1955. And it features an important maneuver that I would like to show you because sometimes your opponent will play very well and will not create weak squares for himself. So sometimes you will have to do that yourselves. And this game is literally a model, a textbook example how to do this. So here e5 was played. And with e5, we have d5 square that is not controlled by the pawn, and it is considered a weak square. But practice showed that this square cannot be exploited uh, efficiently by white, namely because e5 move came with a tempo on the d4 knight. So knight may not take on c6 because after bc6 the d5 square would be covered with a c pawn, and the black center would be very strong. White would have no advantage. So knight had to retreat, and knight on b3 actually is not well posted. He doesn't have, pardon, doesn't have any good squares to go to, uh, and that costs white a lot. So black maintains equality. So yes, we do have a hole on d5, but it cannot be used properly. Bishop e7, castles, uh, castles, bishop e3, bishop e6. We now black has a lot of control over the d5 square. He tries to play d5 to get rid of the backward pawn, and then the d-pawn, d5 square will not be so important for white. Notice that also c7 square is weak, but white cannot exploit it immediately. Uh, and everything else is covered in black position. Same goes for white. Everything is covered currently. There are no weak squares in his position. Bishop f3, a5. Now b5 is weak. And the b6 square. Actually, these are all weak squares. But white cannot use them because knight b5 leads towards nothing. D6 pawn is sufficiently covered. And there is nothing to attack on b5. I mean, there is nothing on c7 nor on a7. So knight b5 cannot be exploited. So the good stuff of the a5 move remain. And that's the a4 threat, kicking the knight. And that's the control over b4 square that might be useful for black knight to go to prepare d5, because from b4 knight will control d5. White hops in with the knight, and with this move, d5 square is no longer a problem for black, because now white pawn physically occupies it, and no piece or no white piece can be installed on d5 successfully to create problems. c4. Okay, white wants to create a counterplay with c5, but after knight a6, c5 is sufficiently covered. So Geller stopped that c4, c5 maneuver for the time being. Now, notice that d4 square is weak. Actually, entire set of squares on the d file are weak, and e2 and c2 is weak too. e4 square is soft. Yes, you will have f3, but then if you play f3, then e3 will become weak. So white, and f2 actually. So white already cannot play with the pawns the way he wants to. He needs to take care. He's slightly worse here. But bishop d2, attacking a5, b6. Now c6 is weak, b7 is weak. All these squares are weak in black camp. Even this, because no pawn controls them. But black does control a c5 square strongly, and that square is a nice outpost for his knight, because due to the horrible position of white knight, white doesn't have b4 to chase it away. Black will simply take on b4 with a pawn and be happy. A3 doesn't work because again white knight blocks the b pawn. So yes, black does have weaknesses outlined with the red color on the diagram, but white cannot exploit them. So only the good stuff from those pawn moves on the queen side remain. Bishop c3, knight c5, and again white took, getting rid of his horrible knight. And yes, this pawn is not protected by the pawn anymore, so he can become he's a weakness that might tie black pieces to his defense. But right now, black does defend it sufficiently and can move it to a4, maybe even a3 to exchange it. Black will have to make some action with f5, because there is nothing he can do on the queen side, because this bishop on c3 defends everything fantastically. So there is no queenside action for black. Center is blocked, so it's time to switch attention uh, to king side. White wants to put some pressure on a5. I don't see why to play that move, but okay, maybe he wants to play bishop d1 and bishop c2 next with f4. Still, black is slightly better in my opinion. Knight d7, clearing the way for f5 pawn, a4, bishop c2, f5. Again, e4 square would be strong for the queen, and then queen would attack on the light squares. But now we can control that square with the pawn, playing f5. e6 square is horribly weak for black, but there is no piece yet that can exploit it. Same goes for c6, for b5, and all this free space in black position cannot be exploited by white at the moment, because there are too many pieces in the middle game. That's why this can become a huge problem in the end game. Rook a d1, g6, queen e2, white has no counterplay, bishop f6, f3, and now comes a fantastic move. With f3, white, look at these weaknesses on the dark squares. Look at them. These are all weak squares. d3 is weak, c2 is weak, and e2 is also weak. Notice this positional sacrifice with e4. e4, bishop takes, queen takes, f4. And what happened with this transformation is that black controls a square with the pawn that can become a nice outpost for his knight. And white has no pawn to control that square. Therefore, this knight will be eternal knight. He will forever be placed on e5. Now, we talked about this before. So what? what does that knight actually do? Is he really dangerous? Well, he is. He is dangerous because from e5, knight will hit the c4 pawn, which is a important pawn for white. And furthermore, knight will support the pawn storm on the king side. And this is very important. Knight also blocks e4, e5 push for white, liberating the bishop. Therefore, this bishop is practically dead. He does exist physically on the board, but his pawns are simply uh, blocking him so much, and this pawn on a4 that he has no action. So again, there was no e5 square available to black. That's why Pielnik never saw this coming. But a small positional sacrifice creates a strong square for the black. And now, of course, Pielnik hoped for f4, which would weaken. Let's put it on the board. f4 would weaken e4 square, and would create prospects of white hoping for g5 next. Actually, this is a bad move for g5 next, and then this square would become weak, and with such weak complex of light squares, white would have some counterplay with the queen d3, having the battery on d3 and c2. And of course, Pielnik didn't allow it. He blocked, the e4 square with a sacrifice, and then simply played f4. So now black has 3 pawns on the king side versus white's 2, and the white's pawn majority is too slow to make anything relevant, because once knight stands on e5, f3 will become a threat. It will loom all the time over white's head, and g4, g5, g4 comes too fast. Rook f2, knight e5, again no counterplay. h3, bishop e2, yeah, the counterplay simply comes too slow for white, so he decided to defend, and he banked on this g3 move. Of course, there is tactics with knight f3. If you go h2, knight takes away these squares. So if you go to h1 or g2, queen will simply take on h3 with a check. So the only move that white had at his disposal, or even on f1, the same goes there. Queen takes the pawn on h3 with a check. So the only move that kept white in the game was king f2, and I love knight d4 here. But Pielnik played queen h3, Geller played queen h3, which is good enough to win the game. g3, g2, the pawn queens simply. King f2, and you cannot defend g1 check. So the rest of the game was irrelevant for our topic. The most important part was the f3, e4 creation of the strong square. Sometimes you need to create a strong square for your pieces. Again, e5 is not controlled anymore with the pawns. Knight will stand on e5, cannot be exchanged by the piece. Now, if you place the knight in this position, I think if we put a knight here, I think that even the engine would change its evaluation to black is better, but he is not winning. And maybe if we put the knight, for example, let's put the knight on c2. Bishop was on c2, let's change it with the knight. What happens here? You see, slightly better for black. Slightly better for black. The same position, practically equal. The same position. Bishop was on c2, remember? and we place the knight. Why? Because you have knight e1, knight d3 challenging this knight. Just a slight change in the position, in the piece setup. Completely different evaluation. Again, another example from the real game. It's played between Keres and Najdorf in Margate. I mean, Najdorf got outplayed in that game, and he hoped that the position was dead blocked and that he would escape with a draw. And again, yes, white has tremendous squares under its control. He would love to put a knight somewhere, maybe on e6, but it doesn't matter because his king cannot penetrate the position. And Keres played c5. c5, clearing the space for the knight. bc5, knight c4. And now, again, black cannot control this square with the pieces, with the pawns, pardon, with the pawns, and knight does tremendous job attacking d6 and a5 from this square. Therefore, it is a strong square for the knight and a weak square for black because he cannot control it with his pawns, nor can he exchange the knight with, with his own knight, with a piece. And of course, if he defends the d6 pawn, there is b6, and where do you go now? On bishop d8, I can take the pawn with check and go to b7, for example. You need to stop the promotion of the queen, and after this move, my king will collect the pawn and simply march in. It's a one position. Or if you maintain this position, this, where do you go? Knight c7, you simply drop the bishop to a double attack. Even on king e8, you have knight c6, and your bishop cannot move. He has nowhere to go. So sometimes you need to create a strong square by sacrificing a pawn and installing a piece there. So keep this in mind. Weak square. I hate that term. That's why I'm showing you these examples with the previous game and this one. Weak square should be a square where opponent's piece will dominate you, should it gets there. That is a weak square. Weak square that is talked about in current literature is not a weak square, it's just an uncontrolled square. The square not controlled with a pawn, and that square tends to become weak square if you cannot chase away opponent's pieces when they land there. Only then, and if those pieces do something useful. So let me recap and bring this stream towards the end. When you make a pawn move, always look at the squares next to the pawn that are weakened with that move when you are deciding whether to make a pawn move or not. So if your pawn was on e2, he controlled these squares, and he had the option of moving to e3, controlling d4 and f4. If you are deciding to play e4, you must take into account the weakening of these squares. Furthermore, do not forget that your pawns clear space. So that might become important because it might clear space for your opponent's pieces to enter into your camp. Until then, your pawn blocked the C2 square physically and was protected by three pieces. So opponent could not stand on E2, and squares on D1 and E1 and F1 were physically inaccessible because pawn physically blocked them. But with E4, your opponent might put a piece on these squares or maybe use them to enter into your camp. So this is a common mistake we all make when we overextend. We move the pawns forward uh, and I don't know. Then opposing piece somehow uses this empty space to enter our position, and then we scratch our head thinking out to ourselves, how did this happen, but where did I go wrong? That's it from me for now. Uh, I hope that you had some useful info from this stream. I hope that it will help you improve your game. You can find this stream archived on my YouTube channel under the playlist from 0 to 2000 FIDE along with other previous streams. Take care of yourselves, and hopefully I'll see you again on the next stream. Bye.